I used to believe the woods were honest, that if you listened carefully enough, long enough, with the right kind of patience, the forest would tell you the truth. But the night that belief died began with a whisper so faint I thought it was the wind calling someone's name, and it didn't sound like a stranger's. It sounded like someone I had once failed to save. My name isn't important, not compared to the things I've seen in the pines. I'm 46 now, older than I ever expected to get in this line of work, with more seasons behind me than ahead. But the years don't toughen you the way people think. They don't make you immune to fear. They just teach you what shape fear tends to take. Mine always circles back to the same memory. The day I lost someone out here, someone who trusted me to bring them home. Ever since that day, the forest has never sounded the same. Every distant crack, every shifting shadow, every call of an animal I couldn't quite identify. All of it carried the same quiet accusation: you let them slip away. That's why people around here know me as the ranger who never lets anyone hike alone, the ranger who checks every campsite twice, the ranger who never shrugs off the strange stories locals whisper over coffee and affordable breakfast plates in the small diner that clings to the edge of town. Others roll their eyes at tales of spirits, creatures, or wanderers who vanished without leaving footprints. But not me. I've seen enough to know that strange doesn't always mean untrue, especially not in the Cascades, where the timberline rises like a jagged spine and the air carries old secrets in its temperature shifts. I work in a stretch of land most folks just call the North Pines. It's a remote patch of forest, dense, dark, deceptively beautiful. To a stranger, it looks like heaven. To a ranger, it looks like paperwork waiting to happen. People get lost out here for reasons they don't always understand. Some swear their compass spun without reason. Others swear they heard voices that led them off trail. And then there are the ones who don't swear anything at all because they're never found. On my first week in these woods, a local told me something I've never forgotten. He was an older man with a beard the color of silver bark, sitting on the tailgate of his truck. He said, the pines aren't haunted the way people think. They're patient. They watch how you walk, how you breathe, how you carry your guilt. And once they know what hurts you most, that's the thing they whisper back. I laughed at the time. I thought he was drunk or bored or just trying to scare the new ranger. But the longer I stayed, the more his warning seeped into me, crawling beneath my skin in quiet moments. Because I did carry guilt. I carried it harder than anyone knew. The woods always seemed to know it. My first strange encounter happened during a late autumn patrol, one of those evenings when daylight fades faster than your sense of direction. The cold had settled early that year, sharpening every breath into a thin mist. I was hiking a ridge near Frost Hollow Trail, checking for blown-down branches and signs of early winter erosion. It was a lonely stretch of forest. No campsites nearby, no reason for anyone to be there unless they were lost or had followed something they thought they heard. About an hour before dusk, I caught a scent on the wind that made me stop mid-step. It wasn't smoke. It wasn't pine. It was something bitter, almost metallic, like rust growing on the air. I told myself it was a dying animal. Sometimes when elk fall injured, the scent of blood sharpens in odd ways. But then I noticed something else. The forest had gone silent. Not quiet, silent. No birds, no squirrels, no wind threading through branches. Even my own breathing felt muted, as if the silence pushed against my mouth and nose, dampening sound. I radioed in a status update, more out of habit than true concern. No response, just static. That wasn't uncommon. The ridges created dead zones that swallowed radio waves whole. But what happened next wasn't the kind of thing you could blame on terrain. As I stepped further down the trail, I heard it, a single knock against wood. It echoed through the trees with a flat, hollow tone, a sound too deliberate to be nature, too rhythmic to be random. I scanned the shadows between the pines, hand instinctively drifting toward the flashlight strapped to my pack. Another knock came. Same pitch, same direction, same uncanny stillness wrapping around it. I called out, half expecting to hear a hiker answer back. Instead, I heard footsteps, slow, measured, almost dragging. They moved parallel to me, hidden just beyond the line of sight. I told myself it was probably someone who'd wandered off trail, cold and disoriented, following the sound of my voice. But the steps didn't feel right. They didn't rise or fall with the terrain. They didn't hurry or hesitate. They just followed, matching my pace with unsettling precision. I stopped walking. The footsteps stopped too. My heartbeat thickened in my ears, and instinct told me I wasn't alone with something human. But guilt is a powerful thing. It makes you rewrite fear as responsibility, danger as duty. I couldn't bear the thought of leaving someone out there, not again, not after what had happened years ago. So I called out again and stepped off the trail. The ground descended sharply, littered with needles and half-rotten logs. I moved slowly, sweeping the beam of my flashlight across the darkness. The scent from earlier returned, metallic, cold, wrong, and the silence grew heavier, almost suffocating. I heard movement ahead of me, a soft shift of weight, breathing that didn't sound like breathing. And then something else, a voice whispering my name in a tone that mirrored the wind, but carried intention. Recognition, almost longing. I felt my pulse spike. No one out here should have known my name. My first instinct was to deny what I heard. I told myself it was memory leaking through, guilt twisting sound into something personal. But then it whispered again, this time closer, as if the darkness between the trees had lips. The forest around me tilted just slightly, like the world was leaning in to listen. And then I saw movement, a tall, pale shape slipping between the pines with unnatural grace. Too fluid to be human, too upright to be animal. Its height was wrong. Its limbs were wrong. And when the light from my flashlight brushed its edges for a fraction of a second, I saw hair, thick, coarse, matted, and eyes that reflected the beam like wet stones. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but something inside me stalled. The eyes, they weren't predatory, they weren't hungry, they were mournful, as if whatever that thing was had known loss too and recognized mine. But before I could even breathe, it let out a low grunt, deep, resonant, filled with a warning I didn't understand. Then it stepped back, vanishing into the deeper dark where the trees grow too tightly for the light to follow. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to rationalize. My fear wasn't the sharp kind that makes you grab your radio and sprint back to the trail. It was the slow kind, the sinking kind, the kind that coils around the old wounds you thought were healed and whispers, "Woe as you aren't done here." The first sound that returned to the forest wasn't the birds or the wind. It was the knock. Once, twice, as if telling me to leave, as if telling me the story wasn't finished. I backed away until my boots found the trail again, and only then did I turn and hurry toward the ridge, breath trembling, guilt gnawing through every step. Even as I climbed, even as distance stretched between me and whatever had watched me from the shadows, I felt eyes pressing into my spine. Heavy, sad, knowing, and that was only the first story the locals still whisper. I didn't speak a word about what I'd seen. Not to the other rangers, not to the sheriff's office, not to the hunters who liked to brag about the shadows they swore were more than bears. Some truths don't survive retelling. They warp, they weaken, they lose the gravity that made them matter. And part of me worried what happened in those trees wasn't meant to be spoken aloud. Not yet. But the forest didn't wait for me to steady myself. Strange doesn't take turns out here. It comes in waves. And once the woods know what you fear most, they don't let it rest. The second encounter came 2 months later in the deep stretch of winter where the pines wear snow the way old bones wear dust. The cold in this region doesn't just touch you, it sinks into you, settling behind the ribs, threading itself through nerves like it's searching for the warmest parts to claim. I'd gotten used to it in a practical way, but not emotionally. The winter woods remind you how small you are, how temporary, how easily the world can forget you. That morning, I was assigned to assist in a search for a missing hiker named Lee. Early 30s, experienced, familiar with the trails, She'd gone out alone, something I never encourage, and failed to return before nightfall. The snowfall had been heavier than predicted, wiping out most footprints and confusing what little trail sign remained. 3 teams set out from different trailheads. I took the southern ridge again, Frost Hollow, the same area where the knocking and the tall figure had followed me weeks before. That alone should have made me uneasy. But what rattled me more was the flyer they handed us, a photo of a smiling woman holding a dog, cheeks flushed with mountain wind, eyes bright with the confidence of someone who believed the woods would always welcome her. Something in that picture twisted in my chest. I'd seen that expression before on the face of someone I failed to bring back. I pushed the memory down the way I always did, but the guilt moved like a tremor beneath the surface. Quiet, but constant. By midday, visibility had dropped to a pale fog that blended with the snow until every direction looked like a washed-out page. Radio contact flickered with static. I checked in every 15 minutes regardless, marking my position, calling out for any sign of her. Nothing answered me except the wind. Then, sometime around early afternoon, I caught the faintest sound of something echoing through the trees. 3 sharp cracks, spaced evenly, traveling fast across the frozen branches. For a moment I thought it was gunfire, but the rhythm was wrong. It wasn't an emergency signal either, not the way hunters or hikers usually tried to get attention. It was familiar. Too familiar. It was the same knock from before. My jaw tightened. It took effort to breathe evenly, to keep moving forward without letting fear take the lead. But fear wasn't the only thing gripping me. What if she heard it too? What if she followed it off trail? What if the woods were using the same lure they'd once used on me? No one tells you this in the Ranger Academy, but sometimes the search isn't just for a missing person. It's for the version of yourself you hope still exists, the one strong enough not to fail again. I'd lost that version once. I wasn't going to let it slip away twice. I veered toward the sound. The deeper I went, the more the temperature dropped. Not the normal cold of winter, but a sharper, hollow cold, as though the forest had exhaled and forgotten to breathe back in. The silence returned too, that unsettling vacuum where every natural thing seemed to step aside. My boots crunched softly over the snow, each step feeling too loud, too self-contained. And then I smelled it. Not the metallic scent from before. This time it was different. Warmer, damp, something like turned earth mixed with wet fur. The kind of scent animals leave behind when they shelter under fallen logs or in the hollows between roots. Except this wasn't near any shelter. It was out in the open, fresh, and strong enough that instinct prickled across my spine. I followed it slowly, sweeping my eyes across the white curtain of fog. My breath puffed out in small clouds, each one drifting toward the sound before dissolving like they'd been swallowed. Then, through the blur of falling flakes, I saw footprints. At first I thought they might belong to Lee. I rushed forward, too quickly really, and dropped to one knee for a better look. But what I saw didn't match any boot tread I'd ever seen. Not from hikers, not from hunters, not from rangers. The prints were wide, deep, and spaced far apart, like they belonged to something tall and heavy. Some impressions were washed out from melting snow, but even distorted, the size was unmistakable. I'd seen something like this before. The night of the whisper. The night of the eyes, the tall shape between the trees. I stood and turned slowly, scanning the tree line, breath hitching with the kind of dread that builds from memory as much as from the moment. Snow drifted sideways on a thin gust. The pines creaked beneath the weight of ice. And somewhere beyond the ridgeline, the knock echoed again, 3 times. I gripped my radio, trying to ignore how clammy my gloves had become. Southern Ridge, moving toward fresh sign, possible tracks, continuing search for missing hiker. Static answered me, but beneath the static, for a fraction of a second, I thought I heard something else. Someone breathing. Soft, uneven, human. Lee? I called out, pulse hammering. If you can hear me, call back. Another breath, the faint crunch of snow, then suddenly movement, fast, to my left. I turned and caught sight of a figure stumbling between two large trees. I didn't think. I ran. Branches slapped my shoulders as I pushed forward, my boots punching deep into the drifts. I followed the figure's path until the fog swallowed them whole. When I stopped, chest heaving, I realized the breathing I'd heard hadn't been mine. It was close. Too close. Something moved behind me. I spun around, just in time to see a large shape disappear behind a ridge of rock. Not the stumbling figure I'd followed. This one moved with purpose. Strength. A heavy silence followed its retreat, broken only by the sharp snap of a branch somewhere deeper in the woods. I should have turned back. I should have called for support. But fear of losing another person drove me harder than fear of whatever walked ahead of me. Guilt makes you braver and dumber in the same breath. I followed the tracks until I reached a clearing ringed by old-growth pines. The fog here thinned enough to see a small indentation in the snow. Disturbed earth, footprints circling, signs of struggle not yet erased by the cold. "Lee!" I shouted again. This time someone answered, a voice drifted from between the trees, weak, frightened. "Help!" Hope surged through me and shattered just as quickly, because the voice didn't sound quite right. It trembled, yes, but the tremble wasn't desperation. It was mimicry, as if someone had learned the shape of the word but not its meaning. "Help?" A long pause as though testing the tone. "Me." I raised my flashlight. The beam cut across tree trunks glazed with ice and snow, illuminating nothing human. My stomach knotted. Something had watched me long enough to learn the voice of a scared person, or worse, long enough to learn mine. The forest around me shifted, breathless and tense. Not wind, not wildlife, something conscious. Then, from the edge of the clearing, a tall shape stepped half into view. Same silhouette, same impossible height, same thick fur and broad shoulders. But this time its posture wasn't mournful. It was protective. It looked not at me, but past me. Into the forest where the mimicry had come from. Something else was in those trees. Something that had used the knock to lure us. Something that smelled of earth and hunger. And for the first time in my career, I realized I wasn't the only one out there trying to keep someone safe. The tall figure huffed a deep, resonant sound and jerked its head, a warning as clear as any human gesture. "Leave. Get out. Take the living while you still can." I backed away slowly, heart pounding with a mix of fear, confusion, and a dawning dread that the pines were hiding more than I'd ever imagined. And then the mimic called out again. Only this time, it used my name. Hearing my own name echo through the clearing stopped me cold. Not because it was loud. It wasn't. It was soft, barely louder than a breath across frost. But it carried an unmistakable intimacy, the way someone whispers the name of a person they've been watching for a long, long time. And the voice didn't just resemble mine. It was mine. Twisted slightly, shaded with a tremor I didn't recognize until it hit me. It sounded like I had years ago, the day I realized I wasn't going to save the person I'd promised to protect. The tall figure, the same creature whose mournful eyes had followed me weeks earlier, stiffened at the sound. Its fur bristled subtly, catching the cold light like needles dusted with snow. It took a single step forward, angling its massive body between me and the stretch of darkness where the mimic had spoken. A guardian's gesture. A threat's warning. Or maybe both. I didn't dare breathe too loudly. My pulse thrashed beneath my ribs, loud enough I felt certain both creatures could hear it. The cold around me grew harsher, not the natural chill of winter, but a deeper cold that seemed to radiate from the trees themselves. A stillness settled over the clearing, thick and expectant, as if the woods were holding their breath. Then the mimic spoke again. This time, it didn't say my name. It said hers, the one I lost. I don't remember drawing my weapon. I barely remember the snow shifting beneath my boots as I turned toward the voice. All I know is fury shot through me like a live wire, raw, protective, instinctual. That voice didn't belong in these woods anymore. That memory was supposed to rest, not be puppeted by whatever waited in the shadows. The tall creature barked a warning, an unmistakable guttural command that vibrated through the trees. It wasn't meant for me. It was aimed at the mimic, and the forest responded. Branches snapped deep in the pines. Snow trembled loose from high boughs. The air tensed as if something enormous shifted beneath the frost. Then, from the tree line opposite the creature protecting me, a low clicking sound began. Slow at first, then faster. Sharp, hollow, unnatural. It reminded me of bones tapping together, or teeth chattering in a throat too big for the body around it. Click, 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 click. The tall figure lowered itself into a defensive stance, shoulders curled forward, breath puffing in heavy bursts. Its silhouette swelled with tension, forming a shield against whatever approached. Watching it, I understood something with chilling clarity. Whatever hunted the missing woman and taunted me with ghost voices terrified even this towering guardian of the pines. A shadow slipped between two trees. Taller than a man but thinner, strangely angular. Its limbs moved like they belonged to a marionette. Jerky, hesitant, yet too quick in the in-betweens. The fog bent around it as if recoiling, and its head tilted in that unnerving way predators tilt when deciding whether the thing in front of them is food or threat. When it spoke again, the voice wasn't mine. It wasn't Lee's either. It was wrong in a way I felt more than heard, like someone scraping memory out of bone. "Help me," the tall guardian growled, deep, thunderous. It stamped the ground once, a signal that seemed to ripple through the earth. The mimic paused mid-step, head twitching in a sharp stutter, as if thrown off balance by an invisible blow. And then, everything happened at once. The mimic lunged forward, its limbs stretching too far for anything living. The tall creature charged with an ear-splitting bellow that rattled frost from the branches. The clearing exploded into chaos, snow hurled into the air, trees shuddering, the forest erupting with a violence that felt ancient. I stumbled backward, nearly falling as the two collided with a sound like timber cracking. The impact sent both creatures reeling. The mimic skidded across the ice with unnatural grace, limbs splaying out like a spider regaining its footing. The guardian planted itself between us again, chest heaving, blood dripping from a deep gash near its shoulder. Steam rose from its fur where the warm blood met the frigid air. For a moment, they stared at each other. Two old enemies, two forces shaped by a wilderness older than park boundaries and rescue protocols. Then the mimic turned its head toward me. Not its body, just its head. Slowly. Too slowly. It opened its mouth and screamed. But the sound wasn't a scream. It was something worse. The exact echo of a man's dying cry from years ago. A cry I'd never been able to forget. A cry I dreaded hearing again in nightmares. My entire body locked up. Guilt, fear, and disbelief fused into a single bolt of paralysis. And in that moment of weakness, the mimic moved. It darted across the clearing with impossible speed, aiming straight for me. The guardian roared and tackled it mid-stride, the two crashing into a cluster of young pines that bent and snapped under the force. Snow cascaded like shattering glass as they tore through branches, each strike sounding like bones splitting. I knew I should run. I knew I should radio for help. I knew I should be the ranger the forest needed me to be. But all I could think about was the woman who was still missing. Somewhere in this chaos, she was either hiding or watching or no longer alive. Fear for myself became irrelevant. Fear for her took over entirely. A screech ripped through the trees as the mimic twisted free of the guardian's grip and sprinted into the shadows, vanishing with the unnatural blink of a trick of the eye. The guardian chased, but stopped short, glancing back toward me with a guttural rumble that vibrated in my bones. It wasn't following the mimic out of defeat. It stayed behind to watch me. Another warning. Another command. Leave now. But I couldn't, not without at least trying to find her. That guilt wasn't letting me take the easy way out. I turned and ran deeper into the woods, ignoring every instinct that shouted at me to retreat. My breath tore through my throat. My boots punched through drifts and tangled roots. Branches whipped my arms and chest. Snow blinded my eyes. I shouted Lee's name again and again, though my voice barely carried. The forest swallowed each call like it was feeding on them. Then something ahead caught my eye, a flicker of movement. a shift of white against darker white. I stopped, panting, and focused through the fog. A glove, half buried in snow, fingertips curled inward. I rushed toward it, heart hammering. When I reached it, I dropped to my knees and brushed away the frost. It was a woman's glove, stiff with cold, and beside it, under an inch of drifting ice crystals, were fresh footprints. Not mine. Small. Human. Leading toward a narrow ravine shadowed by tangled branches. I lifted my radio. I found sign, I whispered, my voice cracking with cold and hope tangled together. I'm moving toward a ravine north of Frost Hollow. Possible tracks. Static. Then, very faintly, a voice answered. But it wasn't the dispatcher. It wasn't a ranger. It wasn't Lee. It was the mimic. It whispered into my radio using her voice. The woman I'd lost years ago. Don't leave me again. My blood froze. My breath caught. And in that instant, the guilt that had tied my life to these woods tightened like a noose. The forest was no longer just following me. It was reaching into my past. The sound of her voice, that voice, coming through my radio, hollowed out my chest in a way no winter cold ever could. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It felt like the forest had reached right into the deepest part of me, dug its fingers into a wound I'd spent years trying to cauterize, and pulled it wide open again. My hand trembled around the radio. I pressed it to my chest as if holding it close could somehow change the truth of what I'd heard. No one else knew that voice. No one else remembered the tremor at the end of her sentences, the gentle rasp she carried when she'd been hiking too long without water, the quiet way she tried to hide fear so I wouldn't worry. No creature should have been able to imitate that. My knees dug into the snow as I hunched forward, choking back the rush of memory that threatened to tear through me. The ravine ahead looked impossibly dark, like an open mouth waiting for whatever wandered too close. I knew stepping inside it was a mistake, the kind that ended stories instead of continuing them. But I also knew guilt doesn't let go of you when danger whispers. It tightens its grip. It drags you toward the places you promised you'd never walk back into. I stood slowly, forcing my breath into something even. "You're not her," I whispered into the frozen air, though I wasn't sure whether I meant it as defiance or a desperate prayer. My voice shook anyway. The forest didn't answer, not with words. It answered with movement. Snow fell from a branch high above, shaken loose by something shifting its weight. The sound echoed unnaturally, carried along the ravine in a slow roll, like someone exhaling through a hollow log. I felt eyes on me again, not from a single point, but from several, watching, measuring. I swallowed hard and stepped toward the ravine. The descent was steep, more like a vertical chute carved by rain over decades. My boots slipped on the frozen soil as I made my way down, grabbing branches for balance. The deeper I moved, the more the sounds of the forest changed. Not quieter, lower, as if the trees here didn't creak but groaned, as if the wind didn't blow but whispered through clenched teeth. Halfway down, I heard it again. A soft crunching. Human footsteps. Slow, unsteady. "Lee!" I called out louder than I'd meant to. My voice bounced between the narrow rock walls, warping into strange echoes that didn't sound like me at all. Another step, closer now. I flicked on my flashlight. The beam sliced across the ravine floor, illuminating fallen branches, clusters of frost-covered stones, and a small divot where someone had clearly stumbled. I followed the tracks, sweeping my light side to side, searching for any sign of movement. Then the beam landed on a shape. A person. Sitting upright against the base of the ravine wall. Snow clung to her jacket. Her head slumped forward. Her arms were wrapped around her knees as if trying to conserve what little warmth she had left. My heart kicked against my ribs so hard I felt dizzy. "Lee!" I shouted, rushing toward her. Her head jerked up, and the first thing I saw were her eyes, wide, terrified, unfocused, not of me, of something behind me. Before I could even turn, she reached out and grabbed my sleeve with frozen fingers. "Don't," she rasped, voice trembling. "It's still here." A crack echoed above us. Sharp, splintering. I spun, flashlight cutting through the dim. A figure perched at the edge of the ravine's lip, its limbs bent at unnatural angles, silhouette long and narrow. It crouched low, head cocked unnervingly far to one side, watching us with a hunger that wasn't physical. It was something deeper, something that fed on fear. And then it moved. It dropped from the ravine edge in a single silent fall that should have shattered bones. Instead, it landed with the fluid grace of something boneless. Snow puffed up around it. Its limbs twitched, adjusted, straightened, and then it began walking toward us in a slow, deliberate pace, as though savoring the inevitability of what would come next. Lee whimpered beside me, and the sound tore through every protective instinct I had left. I stepped in front of her. The mimic stopped just a few feet away. Its head lifted slowly until it aligned with mine. When it opened its mouth, a cold fog spilled out, not breath, but something colder, like the exhalation of a cave that had been sealed for centuries. Then it spoke again. This time, it used my voice perfectly. Every inflection, every tone, every nuance, except one. It spoke without fear. The sound of that hollow version of myself made my legs tremble. It didn't just mimic me, it mocked me. It knew what fear looked like in my voice and deliberately avoided it, the way a predator avoids weakness in its own reflection. I raised my radio with one shaking hand, not to call dispatch, but to remind myself I still existed outside whatever nightmare the woods were weaving. The mimic followed the movement with eerie precision, its head tilting slightly, studying me with fascination or anticipation. "Go," Lee whispered behind me, her voice barely holding together. "Please, it doesn't want me. It never did." Before I could answer, a thunderous roar ripped through the ravine. The tall guardian crashed through the underbrush at the ravine's lip, snow spraying outward as it leapt down with earth-shaking force. It hit the ground between us and the mimic, sending a tremor through the frozen soil. Its massive form stood like a wall, blocking the mimic from advancing any closer. The mimic reeled backward, limbs jerking in rapid spasms, like a puppet whose strings had tangled. It let out a screech, high-pitched, discordant, vibrating through the rocks themselves. The guardian stepped forward, chest heaving, letting out a low bellow that resonated through the ravine like distant thunder. The mimic hissed and twisted its body, retreating toward the deeper shadows where the ravine narrowed like a throat. For a moment, the two creatures stared at each other again, locked in a silent standoff older than anything I could comprehend. Then the mimic vanished into the dark, melting into the ravine's tight, jagged mouth as if the forest itself had swallowed it. The guardian turned toward me. Its eyes, dark, reflective, ancient, held a sorrow I couldn't explain, as if it saw not just me, but the ghost of the person I'd once failed. It exhaled, a deep rumble that felt like a farewell. Then it turned and climbed the ravine wall with astonishing ease, that disappearing into the pines with a quiet that contradicted its massive size, and suddenly it was just Lee and me. She collapsed forward, sobbing in relief. I dropped to my knees beside her, helping her to her feet. The cold had bitten deep into her layers. She shivered violently, her breath breaking into soft cries. But she was alive. That should have been the end of the terror. But as I wrapped my arm around her and prepared to guide her up the ravine, my radio crackled softly in my hand. Static hissed. Then a voice emerged. My voice, whispering from somewhere deep in the frequency. "You can save her." A pause. "But not the next one." The static snapped off and the forest went silent. So silent it felt like the woods were listening, waiting, learning. The radio's silence lingered long after the voice faded, as if the forest were holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do with the warning it had slipped into my ear. Lee clutched my sleeve, trembling violently, and for a moment I felt the weight of two timelines pressing into me. The life I lived now and the one I'd lost years ago. The one where I didn't get there in time. The one where I promised myself I'd let it happen again. I tightened my arm around her. "We're getting out of here," I said, though my voice sounded thin, scraped raw by fear and cold. She nodded weakly, but as I guided her toward the slope, I could feel something watching from the deeper dark where the mimic had vanished. Something waiting. Hunger pressed into the back of my neck like the warm breath of an animal behind me. Every instinct urged me to move faster. Every step up the ravine wall felt like pulling free of invisible hands. We climbed inch by inch, boots slipping, fingers clawing for grip. When we finally reached the top, Lee collapsed to her knees, gasping. I scanned the tree line, flashlight jittering with my pulse. No eyes, no clicking, no shifting silhouette. But the stillness was too perfect, not the calm of safety, but the quiet that follows a threat repositioning itself. "We need to keep moving," I whispered. I didn't know how long the Guardian had kept the mimic at bay, or how long its absence would embolden the thing to follow again. We trudged through the snow, our steps muffled by fresh drifts. The forest around us seemed to lean closer, pines arching as though listening for any sign of weakness. With every branch creak, every faint rustle, my mind replayed the radio's last message. "You can save her, but not the next one." The words threaded through my nerves like a cold wire. It wasn't the threat of the creature that cut deepest. It was the certainty. The forest wasn't guessing. It was telling me what it already knew. I had failed once, and the pines remembered. We kept moving, but Lee began to slow. Her shivering worsened. She stumbled often, each time leaning more heavily against me. Hypothermia was taking her piece by piece. "Stay awake," I urged, trying to sound calm. "Talk to me." She swallowed hard. Her voice cracked when she spoke. "It followed me. Hours. Maybe longer. I thought it was a person. Called my name the way a lost kid might. I almost answered. "You did good," I said, even though she hadn't escaped, even though I'd found her only after something else already had. But she needed to hear those words, and maybe I needed to say them. Then it stopped sounding human, she whispered. Started sounding like it was trying on voices, like clothing. My skin crawled. "Did it ever get close enough for you to see it?" She shook her head violently. "No, I only saw its shadow, tall, wrong, and then something else chased it off. Something huge. The Guardian." Even hearing her describe it made a strange ache fill my chest. I didn't know why the creature protected me, protected us, but the forest didn't operate on human logic. Some things out here felt older, bound to rules we couldn't see or name. As we pushed on, snow thickened again, swirling in diagonal streaks under rising wind. Visibility collapsed to a few feet, the world narrowing to a tunnel of white and shadow. Somewhere beyond the curtain of snow, a distant crack rang out. Then another, then three in a row. The knock. My breath hitched. Lee flinched violently against me. "It's calling again," she whispered. "No," I said, though fear twisted inside me. "Just the wind, frozen branches, stay with me." But I knew better. I'd heard the knock long before she ever entered these woods. It wasn't nature. It was ritual. We reached a small rise overlooking the southern trail, a faint indentation beneath the snow that led back toward the ranger station. Relief surged through my chest so fast it almost buckled my knees. Safety was maybe 30 minutes away. A warm room, thermal blankets, radios that didn't whisper with stolen voices. Then the knock came again, closer this time. And this time, it wasn't 3 knocks. It was 1. Loud. Sharp. Directly behind us. I grabbed Lee and spun us both around, flashlight slicing across a wall of snow and branches. The beam hit nothing. But I could feel it. Whatever had followed us down into the ravine had climbed back out. Whatever the Guardian had fought had regained courage now that darkness thickened. I tightened my grip on Lee and pushed forward. Branches snapped somewhere to our right. Fast, deliberate. Then to our left. Above us, something scraped against bark, long and low, like claws dragging over wet wood. Lee whimpered. "How many are there?" "Just 1, I lied, because the truth would break her. The snowstorm grew harsher, each gust swirling icy flakes into small tornadoes that obscured shape and movement. The wind moaned through the pines with a voice that almost sounded like grief. But underneath that moan, barely audible, came a soft hum. Not from the wind, from the trees. A rhythmic thrum, almost musical, almost soothing. But no sound in these woods was ever just sound. It tightened inside my chest. "It's her," I breathed before I could stop myself. The lost voice. The memory. the forest digging deeper into the wound I thought had scarred over years ago. I heard the hum again, quiet, trembling, the same sound she made once while waiting for rescue in a place I reached too late. Lee tugged my sleeve. Don't listen. But it was too late. The forest knew exactly which thread inside me to pull. A shadow flickered in the corner of my eyes. I swung the flashlight toward it, but the beam only caught swirling snow. I moved the light again, sweeping the darkness, heart pounding hard enough to blur my vision. Nothing, then a face. Not human, not fully. Pressed against the trunk of a tree 20 feet ahead. Too pale, too long. Eyes black as pitch, reflecting the beam like a shard of obsidian. Its mouth hung open just slightly, as if smiling, or imitating a smile. I froze. The creature stepped into full view. The mimic's limbs contorted and straightened, learning how to move more like me, moving with familiarity, confidence. Close enough now that I could see frost clinging to its skin like scales. It tilted its head again, a perfect echo of my own gesture, learned from minutes of watching me. Then it took a step toward Lee. I didn't think. Instinct surged through me with the fury of a blood oath. I planted my body between them, shielded her with my arms, and braced for impact. That's when the Guardian returned. It burst from the trees so suddenly the earth shook. A roar like an avalanche of stones slammed through the woods. Snow exploded from branches. The mimic shrieked, an awful scraping sound, and launched itself backward with unnatural speed. The Guardian hurled its massive weight after it. What happened next came in flashes, a blur of limbs, a crack of breaking trees, the thud of two ancient forces colliding again. The mimic's scream warping into stolen voices, mine, hers, Lee's. The Guardian's guttural bellow echoing with pain and fury. Then a final crash as both creatures vanished into the deeper shadows of the forest. Silence fell. Not the dead kind, the expectant kind, the kind that signals an ending. I didn't wait to learn which creature would emerge first. I dragged Lee through the snow, half carrying her, half stumbling myself, until her weight grew lighter and the slope eased into familiar terrain. The ranger station lights cut through the dark like salvation. When we reached the door, I pushed it open and pulled her inside. Warmth hit us like a physical force. Lee collapsed into a chair, sobbing softly, but alive. I grabbed a blanket, wrapped it around her shoulders, and radioed for the rescue team. Only when she was safe, truly safe, did I let myself exhale. And in that breath, one truth settled into me with heavy certainty. I hadn't been the only one protecting her tonight, nor the only one hunted. When the rescue crew arrived, they asked me what happened. I told them she got lost in the storm. I told them I'd found her in a ravine. I told them the cold nearly took her, but I left out the parts the Pines already knew. Later, after the station quieted and Lee slept under heavy blankets, I stepped outside. Snow drifted softly. The tree line loomed, silent but watching. I stared into the pines and whispered, not out of fear, but out of acknowledgement. I know this isn't over. The wind stirred, brushing through the branches with a low, mournful sigh. And for the first time, I understood what the locals meant when they said the pines weren't haunted so much as patient. Because deep in the forest, something waited, something that whispered with my voice and hers, something that promised, you saved the last one, but not the next. I stood there, breath rising in ghostly clouds, and realized the forest wasn't challenging me. It was warning me, and warnings are never given without reason. The night the pines first whispered my name, I remember thinking the forest was playing tricks on a man who believed he had already seen everything it could offer. That kind of arrogance only grows in people who've worked too many seasons without something pushing back. And back then, yeah, I thought the woods respected me. I thought the trails listened when I walked them. I thought the dark corners stayed still because I knew how to read them. My name, well, names don't matter as much out here as the stories you survive, but the locals call me Pine Walker. They say it with a half grin, half warning, like they're not sure if they're admiring me or preparing my farewell speech. I'm 38 years old now, and I've spent almost 2 decades working the ranges of the Washington Cascades. I patrol a forest that stretches wider than most people ever drive in a lifetime, from the fog-crushed valleys where the morning feels too heavy to breathe, to ridges where the cold bites harder than any predator ever could. This place, it's more than trees and soil. It feels old enough to resent every boot step, and I've learned respect the hard way, because out here, the line between confidence and foolishness is as thin as a pine needle and twice as easy to break. The locals in town like to share stories over coffee as long as the lights are bright enough. I've heard about the caves with bones older than any tribe remembers, the man who followed footprints that weren't shaped like anything that should walk upright, and the woman who swore a yeti screamed her name across the ravine the night before her husband vanished. But the story I remember best wasn't one they meant to tell me. It came from a boy, barely 16, who lived outside of the main stretch of town. He worked part-time at the gas station, wiping down windows for customer tips. He was quiet, eyes too alert for someone his age. One winter evening, as I filled up my truck, he leaned toward me and whispered something that didn't match the soft hum of the fluorescent lights. "They come out when the wind freezes fast," he said, "when breath turns to needles." My brother saw one last year. It watched him from the tree line. It waited. He said the last word like it had a shadow wrapped around it. Waited. I asked him if he wanted to explain what they meant, but his gaze drifted behind me toward the dark stretch of pines swallowing the edge of the highway. That fear, that young, instinctive kind, made my skin crawl more than the story itself. People here grow up with legends. Most laugh them off. But sometimes you meet someone whose fear feels real enough to belong to something breathing. I didn't know it then, but that boy's warning would trail me for months, lingering in the back of my mind during night patrol, echoing inside the quiet moments before dawn. They waited. I brushed it off. I had work to do. A ranger's job doesn't pause for superstition. My station sits near one of the older trail networks, an area with dense undergrowth and tight switchbacks. The terrain changes mood fast. Sunlight can turn to shadow with the tilt of a single cloud. And in the deeper sections, far from any road, the pines stand so close together they seem to breathe in unison. Some days, I swear the forest feels like a living organism, shifting as you walk it, sensing your presence, judging it. I had always been good at my job. I handled lost hikers, injured backpackers, aggressive wildlife, the usual. I was calm under pressure, steady in emergencies. People relied on me, and for the most part, I felt equal to the responsibility. But confidence becomes dangerous when it calcifies, when it stops letting new fear in. That's what happened to me. My first real trouble started on a morning colder than the forecast predicted. The kind of cold that hardens the air, freezes small creeks in one night, and makes every animal track look sharper, as if carved rather than pressed. I was assigned to check on a series of unofficial campsites. Backpackers love to test their luck, setting up shelters in areas we'd clearly marked as unsafe. The woods were quiet, too quiet, even for that season. Usually in early winter, you hear the flutter of birds bedding down in clusters, the distant crack of falling branches under the weight of frost, maybe a coyote call if you're lucky. But that morning, the silence was so deep it felt intentional. Even my footsteps sounded muted, as if the ground had grown tired of holding sound. Halfway through the patrol route, I noticed something strange. Pine needles covered the ground as usual, but they were arranged oddly, like they had settled in faint circular patterns spiraling inward. At first, I thought wind did it, but the circles were too perfect, too deliberate, and there were dozens of them scattered across the underbrush. Small, shallow rings etched into the forest floor, places where the needles had been brushed away, almost cleared. It reminded me of an animal bedding area, except no animal I knew made perfect circles and left no tracks entering or leaving. I crouched, brushing my glove over one of the rings. The soil was colder inside the circle, almost icy. When I stood again, a breeze pushed through the pines, and for the first time that day, the forest made a sound, a low, nearly human moan as the wind forced its way through the tight branches. That was when I heard it. A voice. Faint. Carried on the wind. Not quite my name. But close enough to freeze every muscle in my spine. I spun around expecting to see a hiker or maybe a lost kid, but nothing moved behind me. No body, no shadow, not even a branch twitching. The woods held still, like they were waiting to see if I would acknowledge what I'd heard. I clenched my jaw and forced myself to move forward. You don't let fear anchor your feet out here. That's how people get lost. Or worse. But the deeper I walked, the more the forest seemed to press inward. The pines grew thicker, their trunks narrowing as they climbed, bending in subtle angles that made the path feel unfamiliar. Even though I'd walked that stretch of trail dozens of times, something felt wrong, as if I had taken a single wrong step somewhere miles earlier and ended up in a place I didn't have a name for. When I finally reached the first unofficial campsite, the fire pit was filled with ash, fresh ash still warm at the center. Someone had been there within hours, but the surrounding snow and frost were undisturbed. No footprints, no drag marks, no signs of entry or exit. It was impossible. I crouched to touch the ash again, half expecting my glove to melt from residual heat, and a sudden gust of air blew through the trees, cold, sharp, and smelling faintly of something sour, something like rotting bark. A scent I couldn't place, but one that triggered an instinctive dread, like the forest was exhaling something it had held inside too long. And then from somewhere behind the tree line, a heavy, deliberate thud. Not a branch falling, not an animal landing. A footstep, then another. Slow, weighty, careful. Something big was moving back there, but not crashing through the underbrush the way a bear would. No panting, no snorts, no snapping twigs, just slow, deliberate steps. Like whatever it was, wanted me to hear it. I should have radioed it in. I should have followed protocol, but professionals don't like admitting fear, not even to themselves. And I was a professional. So I turned toward the sound, and the moment I did, the entire forest seemed to hold its breath. I took one slow step toward the tree line, and the cold felt different immediately. Thicker, as if the air had shape, mass, intention. The snow under my boots didn't crunch the way it should have. It sounded muffled, softened, like something beneath the surface was absorbing the impact instead of letting the sound travel. I stood still, listening hard. For a moment, there was only silence, dense, waiting silence. The kind you feel in your lungs before a storm breaks. Then from deeper in the pines, another thud, followed by a scrape like claws or fingers dragging lightly across tree bark. No animal walks like that. Not here. Not in these forests, not anywhere I've worked. And yet, something was pacing just out of sight, studying me. I raised my flashlight, scanning the twisted trunks. The beam sliced through patches of mist, illuminating swirls of frost drifting like pale smoke. The forest seemed to lean away from the light, as if even the trees didn't want to witness what stood in the darkness. A knot formed in my stomach. I told myself it was just adrenaline, nothing more. But another part of me, the part that still listened to instinct, whispered that something was very wrong, and had been wrong long before I stepped into that clearing. I called out the standard line. "Hey, anyone out there? This is Ranger Patrol. Identify yourself." My voice sounded thin, swallowed immediately by the pines. Nothing answered. Not a bird, not a branch, not even the echo of my own shout. The forest simply refused to give the sound back. I tightened my grip on the flashlight. I had a sidearm, but weapons don't fix everything in these woods. Anyone who's worked long enough out here knows that. I took another step. The air shifted. A sudden gust whipped my face, icy enough to sting. And in that gust, faint but unmistakable, I heard something move, fast, circling behind me. I spun, flashlight swinging across the undergrowth. Nothing. But the smell hit me then. Damp fur, cold earth, and something else, metallic, like rust or old blood. It swirled in the air, faint but deliberate. It wasn't possible. Nothing should smell like that in early winter, not unless something had been feeding recently. My breath shook as I exhaled, instinct tugging hard at me now. Leave. Back away. Don't challenge it. But pride is a stupid leash, and mine was wound tight around my neck. I stepped forward again, and that's when something between the trees moved, slightly, subtly, but enough for the beam of my flashlight to catch a shape that should never have been there. Not human, not animal. Something tall. The shoulders were hunched, rising above the undergrowth. The outline was broad, too broad for a man. Its entire silhouette looked wrong, like it had been assembled from pieces that fit together only in the dark. A pale shimmer caught the light where its face should have been. But instead of features, all I saw were two faint, glassy reflections. Eyes, watching me. Unblinking, I froze. My body reacted before my mind could, tightening every muscle, anchoring me to the spot. The woods seemed to grow darker, collapsing inward around us. I could feel my heartbeat in my fingertips, in my teeth, in my spine. The creature, or whatever it was, did not move. It only watched. For how long, I can't say. Time stretched, bent, lost its edges. My breath puffed into the frozen air, but the thing's breath, I never saw it. Not once. When it finally did move, it didn't step or turn. It just slid backward, like a shadow peeling away from a wall. Gone, erased, as if the dark had pulled it in like water swallowing a stone. I didn't chase it. I'm not that foolish. I backed away slowly, forcing myself to breathe as the tightness in the air loosened just enough for sound to return. My boots crunched again, the trees creaked, the forest exhaled. Whatever had watched me was gone, or hiding. Either way, I wasn't staying. The hike back to my truck felt longer than usual. Every sound made me twitch. Every shifting branch felt like an ambush. I didn't trust my own footsteps. I didn't trust the silence either. When I finally reached the trailhead, my legs trembled so badly I had to steady myself against the truck door. My hands shook as I unlocked it, and I remember thinking, so this is what real fear feels like. Not the kind you tell stories about, the kind that crawls beneath your ribs and waits there. I drove straight to the station, didn't check the radio, didn't fill out the forms properly. I walked into the operations room, sat down, and tried to breathe. My supervisor was already there, rubbing his temples over a pile of maintenance reports. He looked up when he heard me. "You all right?" he asked. I opened my mouth, but the truth caught in my throat. I didn't know what to say. And even if I did, I doubted he would believe me. Nobody tells their boss they saw something impossible on the job, not unless they want an evaluation. "Yeah," I said, "just tired." He nodded, accepting the lie without question. But then, just as I sat down, he said something that pulled me upright. Strange morning for calls. 3 hikers reported hearing something large moving through the trees, said it followed them for half a mile. My blood went cold. Same area, I managed. He nodded. North Ridge, exactly where I'd been. He didn't say anything else. Didn't have to. We both knew what predators were active this time of year, and none of them matched what I'd seen. Then he added, quietly, too quietly, "This is the 3rd time this month. A knot formed in the space between my lungs. 3? Same description?" He hesitated. They didn't give a description, just said whatever it was, felt wrong. His voice faltered on the last word. He didn't know that I understood exactly what they meant. After my shift ended, I drove home, but the forest came with me. The memory of those eyes, reflective, still, intelligent, stayed lodged behind my own. I tried to sleep that night, but every creak of my cabin made me sit up, heart hammering. Around 2 a.m, I heard something outside, soft, dragging footsteps across the gravel driveway. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the window. Nothing stood there, but the air was thick with that same metallic scent. I barely slept the rest of the night. The next day, I met up with 2 veteran rangers, older men who'd been working the region long before me. They'd heard rumors, seen strange tracks, responded to missing person cases that never made sense. I asked them, cautiously, if they'd ever experienced anything unusual. The older of the 2, grizzled, thick-bearded, eyes too tired for his age, leaned back and looked at me for a long time before he spoke. "You ever hear the stories locals whisper?" he asked. I nodded. He drew a slow breath. "Most folks think they're just legends. We let them think that. Easier that way. But some of us, we've seen things we don't write down." He stared at me, studying my reaction. What did you see? I hesitated. Tall, I said quietly. Wrong shape, eyes that didn't blink, and no breath. Not in the cold. The man didn't flinch. He simply nodded, as if confirming something he'd long suspected. Yeah, he said. Sounds about right. I stared at him. Right? What do you mean, right? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked past me toward the forest stretching beyond the station windows. Things live in these pines, older than the trails, older than the stories. Some walk on 2 legs, some on 4, some neither. Most stay hidden. But when winter comes early, they move. I felt my stomach turn. Move where? He met my eyes. Toward us. A chill slid down my spine, colder than the air outside. Then he said something I still hear whenever I'm alone in the woods. The forest tests the ones who claim to protect it, and it doesn't stop until it decides whether you belong or you're prey. His words didn't settle. They struck something in me I didn't want disturbed. The idea that the forest could judge, that it could choose who belonged and who didn't, felt like superstition. But the way he said it, steady and unblinking, made it feel like fact carved into bedrock. I walked out of the station after that conversation, feeling the cold in a different way. It wasn't just temperature. It felt like presence. The kind that follows, the kind that studies, the kind that waits. The snow had thickened overnight, muffling the world again, but something in the air carried weight. Every sound was slightly distorted, as if the forest was listening more intently than usual. I stood on the wooden deck outside the station, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, not even the wind. But I felt watched. I wasn't scheduled for patrol that morning, but staying inside, pretending the woods weren't shifting around me, that felt worse. So I geared up, checked my flashlight, tightened my laces, and radioed in anyway. No one questioned it, probably figured I needed the distraction. I drove out toward the North Ridge, the same route I'd taken before. The truck tires crackled over frozen gravel, and I kept glancing in the rear view, half expecting to see something tall and pale drifting between the trees behind me. But each time I looked, the road stretched empty. When I parked at the trailhead, the forest felt even quieter than before. As I stepped out, my breath fogged instantly, drifting upward like thin smoke. The moment my boots touched the snow, the silence pressed inward again. I walked. The farther I went, the heavier my steps felt. Not physically, not fatigue. Something else, something internal, as if the air demanded caution with every footfall. The pine needles shifted under a gentle wind, and the sound was almost like whispering, soft, overlapping, unintelligible. The same circles were there, scattered along the path, more of them than before. Some were small, barely the size of my hand. Others were wide enough for a grown man to lie down in. All of them were too perfect, too even, as if measured by something that understood precision. I crouched near one of the larger rings and brushed the needles aside. Again, the soil inside was unnaturally cold. Frost clung to it like tiny crystals, far thicker than on the surrounding ground. I was about to stand when I heard a sound behind me. A faint crunch. Bootsteps. Human. I turned sharply, hand instinctively reaching toward the radio. A man stood about 20 feet away, bundled in mismatched layers, heavy coat, tattered scarf, old ranger boots that had seen better decades. His beard was white, long, tangled, and his eyes were a piercing gray that didn't seem to blink often enough. I didn't recognize him. Not a ranger, not a local I knew. You shouldn't be in this part of the forest, I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. It's restricted in winter. He tilted his head slightly, as if weighing my voice, my stance, my intention. Restricted, he repeated softly. Yeah, been that way a long time. Something about his voice made me tense. It wasn't the words, it was the way he said them, like he knew more than I did. Sir, if you're lost, I can... Not lost, he interrupted. Just walking old routes. His eyes drifted past me toward the larger circle near my feet. They're closer this year, he murmured. My breath hitched. You know what these are? He paused. The wind shifted. The trees rustled a little, like they were listening too. You think the forest belongs to you rangers, he said quietly. You think these markers are random? Signs of animals? Wind? His voice lowered. They're not. A strange unease crawled up my spine. What are they then? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, slowly, deliberately, and leaned on a cane that looked hand-carved, etched with symbols I didn't recognize. Spirals, intersecting lines, strange geometric shapes arranged like a map from somewhere older than this land. He pointed toward the circle with the cane's tip. They're places where the forest thins, he said, where the veil gets stretched, and where something on the other side leans through. A cold pulse shuddered through me. I stared at him, searching for signs of delusion. He seemed lucid, too lucid. What exactly is leaning through? I asked. He finally looked at me, really looked, and something in his gaze carried an exhaustion I didn't understand until much later. Not what, who. I didn't know what to say. He continued. Long before towns came, long before these trails were carved, others walked this place, tall ones, silent ones, born of stone and root and shadow. His breath fogged in front of him as he whispered, and they remember who used to belong here. My heartbeat stumbled. I tried to keep my voice steady. And you've seen them? The man didn't smile, didn't blink. He simply nodded once, more than once. The forest shifted around us, a gust rippling through the branches. The whispering sound returned, faint but unmistakable, threading between the trees like distant voices carried on wind that shouldn't exist. He didn't seem startled. You saw them too, he said. 2 nights ago. Near the ridge, I stiffened. How did you know that? He tapped his cane against the snow. You have their scent on you. I stepped back involuntarily. Instinct. Fear. Before I could question him further, he said, you need to leave this area. Today. Now. They're watching you more closely than the others. My mouth went dry. Why me? He finally showed a flicker of emotion, sympathy, because you walked into one of their circles. That's an invitation. I looked down at the rings again, suddenly feeling exposed. He took a slow breath, and because you heard your name in the wind. I felt a jolt of recognition. He shouldn't have known that. The wind doesn't speak on its own, he said softly. Something calls through it. Not to everyone, just to the ones who get too close. My radio crackled then, sharp, piercing, making both of us flinch. Bass to Pine Walker. Do you copy? I raised it toward my mouth, but hesitated, eyes locked on the stranger. When I turned back toward him fully, he was gone. No footprints leading away. No sound of movement. Just empty snow and whispering branches. My stomach dropped. The radio crackled again. Pine Walker, do you copy? I forced myself to answer. Yeah, I'm here. We've got reports of calls echoing along the North Ridge again. High-pitched. Human-sounding. We need you to confirm. My throat tightened. Which direction? North-northwest, came the reply. Near the old cave system. The cave system. Not many people knew about it. Not officially, anyway. I took a shaky breath and said I was already nearby. I headed deeper into the woods. With every step, the air grew colder, sharper, as if invisible threads pulled me toward something ancient, something waiting. The trees grew tighter, the shadows heavier. The whispering grew more defined, no longer random wind noise, but rhythmic, almost like language. Then, the first echo reached me, a long, mournful call that sounded human, but stretched, elongated, as if the voice came from lungs too large for any normal creature. It bounced off the ridges, repeating, distorting. The second call followed, shorter, rougher. A reply. 2 voices speaking across the forest. I felt a shiver cut through me. They weren't animal, not even close. As I moved toward the old cave mouth, the one carved into the base of the ridge like a yawning throat, the air shifted again. Warmer now, unnaturally so, like breath drifting out from the earth itself. I tried to steady my breathing. That's when I saw tracks, large, deep, too deep, far heavier than any bear, far wider than any boot, and mixed among them, smaller prints. Human, barefoot, leading toward the cave. I crouched, studying them, dread building in layers. They belonged to a child, a small one, maybe 6 or 7 years old, but there were no reports of missing children in the area. As I followed them, each step forward felt like a mistake. The trees thinned ahead, revealing the cave entrance, dark, cold, waiting. And just before I reached it, I heard a whisper float from within. Not the wind, not an echo. My name, spoken clearly, spoken softly, spoken by a voice I didn't recognize. The whispered name didn't echo. It didn't drift. It floated out of the cave with a gentle warmth, as though spoken inches from my ear. I froze mid-step, the air in my lungs turning to stone. There are moments in a ranger's life, rare ones, when the instinct that has kept you alive screams louder than rational thought. That whisper was one of them. Still, something in me stepped forward, not bravery, not stupidity. Something else, a pull, like a thin thread had wrapped around my ribs and tugged me toward the dark. I clicked my flashlight on. The beam cut through the entrance, revealing nothing but smooth stone walls coated in a thin sheet of frost. The cave's mouth narrowed inward like a throat swallowing light. That warm breath I'd felt earlier still drifted out, unsettling, incongruous with the biting winter air behind me. I lifted my radio slowly. Base, I'm at the old cave system. I heard. A sudden gust surged from inside the cave, slamming against me hard enough to shove my words back down my throat. My radio crackled and died in my hand, static then silence. The wind outside stopped completely. The world held still. Another whisper came from the dark, quiet, trembling, unmistakably frightened. Help me. A child's voice. My pulse surged. My flashlight trembled in my grip. I knelt quickly to examine the barefoot tracks again, my breath clouding the air in frantic bursts. They were definitely the tracks of a child, but there was something off. The stride was wrong. The spacing didn't match the way children walk. Not playful, not hurried, not panicked. These steps were placed deliberately, carefully, each print pressed with the same pressure, the same depth, no stagger, no rhythm change, no sign of fatigue, like the child wasn't walking, like it was being guided or carried. The whisper came again, closer this time. Please, don't leave me here. My jaw clenched. Fear can twist rationality fast, and part of me wanted to sprint into the cave, grab whoever needed help, drag them out. But another part, the part that knew the forest, knew its behaviors, knew its patterns, recognized something deeply wrong. The voice didn't shift with distance. It didn't bounce off the walls. It hovered, floating, steady, controlled. A mimic, not human, but that possibility brushed against something inside me, something tender, something I never admitted even to myself. Years ago, I'd responded to a missing child call. A 7-year-old girl wandered off a campground while her parents were setting up tents. We found her hours later, curled beneath a hollowed cedar, crying so hard she couldn't breathe. I carried her out, felt her shaking against my chest, felt the weight of how close we'd come to losing her. Ever since then, I carried a quiet fear, losing someone small in the dark, failing a voice that asked for help. That memory surfaced now, clawing at my reasoning. For a moment, the fear of being deceived mixed with the fear of walking away from something genuinely in danger. I lifted my flashlight, steadied my breath, and stepped inside. The temperature changed instantly, dropping several degrees in a single stride. My breath thickened, turning to fog. The walls narrowed enough for my shoulders to nearly graze the stone. Each step echoed faintly, but the cave's own sounds didn't echo back. My beam scanned the walls. Strange markings etched into stone, spirals, lines, symbols vaguely similar to those carved into the cane the old man carried. They ran along the walls in uneven patterns, as if someone or something had carved them in haste. Then the air shifted again. Another whisper. Closer. Right ahead. Please. The beam caught movement then. A small shape at the bend of the cave, knee-height, crouched. My heart lurched. For half a second, it looked like a child huddled in the dark, arms around knees. Hey, I said, voice trembling. It's okay, I'm a ranger, I'm here to help. The figure didn't look up. I stepped closer, cautious, hand hovering near my radio, though I knew it was useless. Are you hurt? I'm here. The figure twitched, just slightly, wrongly, then the head lifted. But there was no face, no mouth, no eyes, nothing human, just a pale, smooth surface like bark peeled from a dead tree. I staggered back, breath ripping from my throat. Then the thing unfolded. Not stood. Unfolded. Limbs lengthening, stretching impossibly, scraping along the walls as it rose higher than a human should be able to. The sound was wet, like tendons sliding over stone. Something fell from its body and hit the ground near my boot. A boot print. Mine. A perfect copy pressed into a scrap of frost-covered soil that it had carried inside its flesh like something held in a pocket. My breath froze. The creature leaned toward me, its head tilted. No face, no mouth, but somehow I felt it watch me. Then it spoke again, not with lungs, not with a throat, not with anything alive. My voice, my exact voice. "Don't leave me here." Panic detonated inside me. I fumbled backward, flashlight wobbling wildly across the stone walls. My boot caught on a rock, and I slammed onto my hands, pain shooting through my wrist. The creature moved, fast, quiet, fluid. Its limbs scraped with the sound of branches bending under winter ice. I scrambled backward like breath-ragged boots sliding on the frozen floor. My flashlight beam flickered across the thing's limbs, long, gnarled, jointed at unnatural angles. It stepped closer. I kicked out instinctively, hitting nothing but cold air. The cave walls felt like they were closing in, shrinking with each frantic breath. My chest tightened, my throat burned. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. The creature leaned forward again, lowering its faceless head to my level. Then, from deep within the cave, a sound erupted, a howl, low, powerful, shaking the stone. The creature froze. The howl came again, closer, resonant, heavy with something primal, a force that made the cave tremble. The faceless thing snapped upright, limbs jerking, and retreated into the darkness faster than I could track. Its body folded back into itself, shrinking, compressing, sliding into a crevice in the cave wall that shouldn't have been wide enough for anything alive to slip into. It vanished. The howl echoed once more, this time so close it vibrated through my ribs. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline drowning every conscious thought. I stumbled out of the cave, nearly falling onto the snow outside. The air outside hit me like a slap, cold, sharp, real. The forest was silent again. The trees stood frozen, watching. My breath came in frantic gasps as I backed away from the cave. When I turned, I saw something impossible. Huge tracks, massive, wider than my torso, circling the cave entrance. The same type I had seen earlier, fresh, deep. Something large had stood there while I was inside, something that had howled. The old man's warning rang in my ears. Not what? Who? The trees creaked in the distance, a long groaning sound like old wood shifting under immense weight. I forced myself to move, stumbling through the snow, following my earlier trail with shaking legs. Every instinct screamed to run, but something told me not to, not here, not while unseen eyes tracked my steps from the shadows. When I reached the tree line, I dared one last glance back. Something tall stood at the cave entrance again, its silhouette framed by the pale winter light. But the moment my eyes focused, the figure stepped back into darkness and dissolved. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, hands trembling, jaw clenched, pulse hammering. As I drove back toward the station, a single thought settled deep inside me like a stone falling into a dark lake. The child's voice, the one begging for help. It wasn't a lure, not completely. There had been a child in that cave once, long ago, and something else had learned how to use that memory. The drive back to the station blurred into a haze of snow, fog, and intrusive thoughts that refused to let go. A child had been in that cave, once. I didn't know how I knew it, but the certainty lodged deep. The mimicry wasn't random, it was memory. And whatever lived in those tunnels had learned to weaponize memory like a hunter uses scent. When I reached the station, I sat in the truck for minutes, gripping the steering wheel, refusing to step out. The building's windows glowed soft yellow, warm and safe-looking, almost out of place against the cold forest. I wondered if that safety was an illusion, something man-made trying to pretend it belonged here. Eventually, I forced myself inside. My supervisor glanced up from a map spread across the table. He frowned as soon as he saw me. "You look like hell." I ignored it. My voice cracked more than I wanted when I said, "We need to close the North Ridge. Now. Today." He stared at me, waiting for details. I didn't tell him everything, didn't describe the faceless thing, didn't mention the mimicry or the symbols etched into the cave walls. But I told him enough. The footprints, the voices, the howl, the fact that something large was moving through the area with intention. His face shifted. Tension, worry, doubt. "You sure you're not rattled from the cold?" he asked gently. "We've seen illusions before. Frost tricks, echo anomalies. When the wind..." This wasn't the wind. My voice was sharper than intended. His expression tightened. "Look," he said carefully, "I trust your experience, but we need evidence before we close an entire section. You know the drill. Evidence." The word felt hollow. Before I could respond, one of the veteran rangers, the older man from earlier, stepped into the room. His boots were wet with melted snow. He must have been outside listening. He approached slowly, eyes locked on mine. He saw something, didn't he? The old ranger asked my supervisor without looking away from me. My supervisor exhaled sharply. "Something." "Yes." The old ranger nodded as though confirming a quiet expectation. Then he said, "Let me talk to him. Alone." My supervisor hesitated, then left the room. When the door clicked shut, the old ranger lowered himself into the chair across from me. For a while, he said nothing. His silence wasn't dismissive. It was heavy, like he was measuring the air between us. "You went to the caves," he finally murmured. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. "And you walked inside." I swallowed. "I heard a child," I said quietly, a voice begging for help. He nodded slowly, sadness etching deep lines across his face. "They use what you fear most." I stiffened. "How do you know that?" "Because they used mine," he whispered, "long before your time." The room felt colder suddenly. What happened? His eyes drifted, long and distant, as if watching something from years ago. "My brother disappeared near that ridge when we were young," he said. "They found his pack, his coat, but not him. Weeks later, I heard him calling to me in those trees, calling for help. Same voice, same words. A shiver ran through me, but when I followed the sound, I found them." His voice trembled, just slightly. "What did you see?" He shook his head. "Not now. Not again. But I'll tell you this. They don't mimic to lure. Not always. Sometimes they mimic because they're remembering. Repeating. Echoing the last thing they heard before someone disappeared. The weight of those words crushed something in my chest. Before I could respond, he leaned forward. "If they've noticed you, you need to be careful. Don't go alone. Don't answer when they speak your name. And never, never step into their circles again." I opened my mouth to ask a dozen questions, but a sudden pounding rattled the station door. 3 sharp knocks. My blood froze. All 3 of us turned. The old ranger motioned silently for me to stay seated. He moved to the door, slow and cautious, his hand hovering near the handle of his belt knife. "Who is it?" he called. Silence. A second set of knocks, slower this time, heavier as if testing the wood. My supervisor stepped back into the hallway, frowning. "Expecting someone?" he asked. The old ranger lifted a hand for quiet. Then we all heard it, a voice from the other side of the door, barely above a whisper. "Help me." My skin crawled. The voice wasn't a child's now. It was that trembling, terrified voice of someone lost. My supervisor tensed. "That sounds like a hiker." "It isn't," the old ranger hissed. "How do you know?" "Because no hiker finds this station on foot in winter." The knocking came again, louder now, more frantic. "Please, help me." The voice quivered, but something in its tone felt wrong. Off. Hollow. Like someone pushing sound through a mold that didn't quite fit. My supervisor reached for the door handle. I jumped to my feet. "Don't open it." He glared at me. "This is a ranger station," he snapped. "We don't leave people outside in this cold." The old ranger stepped between us and the door. "We do," he said, "when they're not human." Silence swallowed the room. My supervisor stared at him like he'd grown antlers. Another knock, this time a heavy, dragging sound across the wood. The voice outside lowered to a whisper again. "Let me in." Something inside me clenched. I knew that cadence, that strange, delicate dragging in the vowels. The creature in the cave had used my voice that way. The old ranger pressed his palm to the door, feeling the vibrations of the knocks through the wood. His face went pale. "It's tall," he whispered. "Higher than the frame." My supervisor's expression finally cracked. "What the hell?" A sudden thump rattled the entire wall like something massive had pressed its weight against the siding. We backed away. The knocking stopped. So did the voice. The silence that followed felt wrong, Too immediate, too complete, like something had simply wiped the sound away. Then, faintly, from the tree line behind the station, a howl, long, low, the same howl I'd heard in the cave, but this time, layered. Two tones, two voices, two creatures calling at once. The old ranger whispered, "They're gathering." Instinct took over. We locked the doors, killed the lights, moved to the inner hallway where the walls were thickest. My pulse hammered so hard my vision pulsed with it. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, a scraping sound along the siding. Slow, intentional, like claws dragging along the wood, followed by another and another, encircling the building. My supervisor whispered shakily, "How many are there?" The old ranger closed his eyes. Enough. Fear clawed at me, not the acute kind, the deep kind, the kind that tears at your sanity. The kind that tells you a truth your mind isn't built to hold. Eventually, slowly, the sounds faded, but the quiet they left behind felt worse, like the forest wasn't done, like it was deciding something. After what felt like hours, the old ranger finally exhaled. "They won't break in, not while we're together." His voice shook just enough for me to realize he wasn't reassuring us, he was reminding himself. When the forest fell still again, I stepped outside alone. I don't know why. Maybe I needed proof. Maybe I needed to breathe the outside air. Maybe I needed to understand what had marked me. The snow was untouched, except for 3 massive impressions near the station porch, deep enough to pool with dark water where warmth had melted the frost. I stared at them until my breath steadied. This was real. This had always been real. All those stories whispered by locals, dismissed by tourists, buried by time, they weren't warnings. They were records. The forest had been testing me, watching me, judging me, and now it knew my fear. I stood there, listening to the pines groan in the winter wind, feeling something vast moving behind the darkness, something ancient, patient, and terribly intelligent. Most people think forest rangers protect the woods, but nobody tells you what happens when the woods decide they no longer want your protection, but your attention. My voice shook as I whispered into the trees, "I'm still here." The wind shifted. The branches leaned. Somewhere far off, something answered, soft, distant, almost approving. For the first time in my career, I understood. I wasn't just walking these forests. I was trespassing in something older than memory, older than man, older than the soil beneath my boots. And the spirits of the pines, the ones locals still whisper about, they weren't myths. They were guardians. They were hunters. They were watchers of every secret this land had buried, and they had finally decided to notice me. I learned early in my life that the quietest places are the ones that remember the loudest. The first time I felt that truth sink into my bones was on a cold October morning, long before I ever wore the badge or carried the weight of responsibility that comes with guarding a forest older than any written memory. But even now, decades later, I still feel that same hush ride the wind, an old, knowing silence, whenever the pines lean in just enough to make you wonder if you've stepped someplace you weren't meant to be. My name doesn't matter as much as the paths I've walked. I'm 46 years old, and I've served as a ranger in the northern stretch of the Cascades for nearly half my life. The folks who live around these parts don't care much about introductions. They want to know if you can read the weather, track a missing hiker, calm a spooked black bear, and whether you believe them when they talk about the things that roam beneath the canopy long after sunset. Most newcomers laugh off the stories, chalk them up to backwoods superstition. But locals, they speak in lowered voices. They pause in the middle of sentences, glancing toward the tree line as if something old might be listening. I didn't grow up here, but I've grown into this place. My days begin before dawn most of the time, walking out of the cabin that sits at the base of Ridgewell Peak. The forest sprawls out in every direction, jagged and unplanned, the kind of wilderness that resists being mapped no matter how advanced our tools become. Pines tower overhead like cathedral columns, their needles whispering in a language I still can't decipher. The scent of pitch and damp earth clings to the air year-round. Even in summer, there's always a little cold tucked in the shadows. People imagine rangers as stoic, fearless, built from some unshakable mold. But the truth is, we're just people who've spent enough nights alone in the woods to understand how quickly confidence can turn brittle. I started this job thinking I had iron nerves. I'd read the manuals, done the survival training, walked miles of trail without flinching at the groan of shifting branches or the sudden snap of underbrush. But the forest knows how to teach humility. It waits. Patient? Patient. And the first time it decides to test you, you remember that you're built of soft, breakable things. My earliest shift as a new ranger was supposed to be uneventful. Patrol the southern path, check on a few old fire rings that needed dismantling, monitor the conditions near cliffside washout, and then head back before dark. The supervisor warned me not to wander too close to a cave system that cut under a portion of the ridge, said the rock was unstable, easy to get turned around, and impossible to navigate without proper equipment. What he didn't tell me was what the locals believed about those caves. That came later. That morning, the forest held a crisp stillness that felt almost ceremonial. A thin mist clung to the ground, catching the light in slow-moving ribbons, and for a while, the only sound was the rhythmic crunch of pine needles under my boots. There was something comforting about being the first human footprints on a trail each day. It made the forest feel open, unchanged, like I was stepping into a space still half dreaming. But halfway through the patrol, a shift in the air brushed the back of my neck. It wasn't a sound. Not exactly. It was more like a pressure, a change in the atmosphere, a quiet urging that drew my attention toward the right side of the trail. That was where the slope dipped toward the caves, though I didn't know that at the time. All I knew was that I suddenly felt watched, not by an animal, not by a person, by something that didn't care whether I understood its presence or not. I shook it off. New ranger jitters, I figured. Everyone gets them. When you first start, your senses are turned too high, your instincts caught between caution and imagination. I kept moving, but the weight didn't ease. If anything, it pressed harder, like invisible fingertips trailing just behind me, matching my pace. The first strange thing I noticed was the smell. At elevation, the air is crisp, clean, scented with sap and mineral-rich stone. But this smell, it was damp, old, like wet fur that had been buried underground for too long. It drifted in and out of the breeze, faint but persistent, until I realized I wasn't imagining it. I stopped walking and drew in a slow breath. There it was again, earthy, heavy, alive. I scanned the tree line. The underbrush was still. No movement, no birds, no squirrels chittering, nothing. Just that smell. Then I heard the knock. It was so soft at first I almost missed it. A single hollow tap, like knuckles brushing the trunk of a tree. I stood completely still. Another knock came, this time clearer, more deliberate. It echoed faintly, bouncing between the trees. The cadence was slow, spaced too far apart to be woodpeckers, too controlled to be falling branches. It sounded intentional. Knock. Pause. Knock. Longer pause. Knock. It wasn't threatening, not yet, but it was wrong. The spacing between each knock felt too guided, like someone trying to mimic a sound they'd heard humans make, but getting the rhythm slightly off. My instincts whispered at me to walk away, to stay on the trail, to ignore it. But the job required investigation of anything unusual, no matter how uneasy it made me feel. I stepped off the path. The forest immediately changed around me, not visually, but emotionally. On the trail, the world feels open. Off it, the air compresses. The sound of your own breathing grows louder. Distance becomes harder to judge. I moved carefully, checking for loose ground. Another knock sounded, closer this time. My pulse tightened, a subtle throb building behind my ribs. I reached a cluster of old pines leaning against each other like tired sentinels. Their trunks were scarred and rough. I ran my hand over the bark, cold, damp. Nothing unusual. But the smell was stronger now, thick enough to taste. Then I saw it. Pressed into the soil were tracks. Not boot prints, not bear prints, something in between. Wide forefoot, elongated toes, deep pressure in the heel. Not quite human, not quite animal. They led toward the direction of the caves. I crouched down, touching the edge of one. Fresh. That was when the knocking changed. It became faster, tap, 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 like knuckles drumming eagerly on a door. The sound came from deeper in the woods, near where the tracks disappeared. Something wanted me to follow. I should have called it in. I should have backed away, marked the location, and radioed the supervisor. But I was too young then, too eager to prove I had the instincts of a real ranger. I convinced myself it was a lost hiker playing some sort of joke, or maybe someone who didn't want to be found. Logic can be a comfortable lie when fear begins to lick at your heels. I followed the tracks. The forest grew darker as I moved. The canopy thickened, swallowing the morning light. The temperature dropped noticeably, 10 degrees at least. The knocking shifted again, growing softer, almost coaxing. The scent of wet fur filled my nose. I stepped into a clearing where the ground dipped sharply downward, and that's when I froze. At the far end was the entrance to a cave. Jagged, narrow, mouth-like. A slow draft pushed outward from the dark, carrying that same stale, living odor. The tracks led straight inside, but the cave wasn't what stopped me. Standing just outside the entrance was a silhouette, tall, broad, still. A shape that seemed carved out of the shadows themselves. I couldn't make out its features, but I knew one thing instantly. It was watching me, and it wasn't hiding its interest. It tilted its head, slowly, too slowly. Then the knocking started again, this time from behind me. The moment that knock sounded behind me, every instinct inside me clenched like a fist. I didn't turn right away. Turning felt like an invitation, like acknowledging something I wasn't prepared to see. The silhouette near the cave entrance didn't move. It just held that impossible stillness, head tilted, body carved from darkness and cold. But the knock behind me, that was closer. Too close. Close enough that I felt the vibration of it tremble faintly in the ground beneath my boots. I finally forced myself to pivot, slow and deliberate, and the forest behind me looked exactly as it had before. Empty, quiet, still. No movement, no figure, no animal, just the dense wall of pines, ribs of shadow between them, and the sound of my own breathing pressing like static in my ears. But the knock had come from there. The echo still lingered in the trees like a bruise. When I turned back toward the cave, the silhouette was gone. Vanished. No footstep. No shift of branches. Nothing. Only the darkness inside the cave remained, like a mouth that had just swallowed something whole and was waiting for its next offering. A trained ranger knows what to do when confronted with something they can't categorize. You retreat safely. You radio it in. You gather more experienced team members. You do not, under any circumstances, go closer. My mind knew that. My training knew that. But there's something about fear that feels personal when you're young. You tell yourself you're imagining things. You rationalize every warning sign until its voice is barely audible. You cling to reason because it's the only barrier between you and the truth, that this forest is ancient. And you are not, and there are things older than language watching you learn that the hard way. I stepped backward, ready to turn away, when I noticed something lying in the dirt near my feet. A small, broken piece of wood, freshly splintered, edges sharp, one side smooth like it had once been part of a larger branch, or maybe a door frame. But what struck me most wasn't the fragment itself. It was what marked its surface. Knuckle dents, 3 of them, pressed deep. I didn't pick it up. I didn't need to. The realization settled like an ice-cold hand on the back of my neck. The knocking hadn't been on a tree. It had been on wood carried by something. The forest around me seemed to tighten, the air suddenly heavier, the quiet too absolute. I felt exposed, like every pine needle was an eye fixed on me from every direction. I took one slow step back onto firmer ground. A gust of cold air spilled out from the cave, brushing against my face. Except it wasn't just cold. It felt exhaled. Moist, warm beneath the chill, like the breath from something alive deep within the stone. I stepped back again. My heel scuffed the dirt. My breath quickened. Then a sound drifted up from inside the cave. Not a knock this time, a low, wet inhale. like something dragging air between teeth too wide for the mouth that held them. That broke the lie I'd been clinging to, the one that said I could handle this, the one that told me I wasn't in danger. My legs finally obeyed my instincts, and I turned sharply, moving back toward the trail, leaving the cave and its unwanted breath behind me. I didn't run. Running means surrender. Running draws pursuit. I walked with the stiff, controlled movements of someone pretending not to be afraid, someone who knows damn well fear is dripping from every pore. The forest didn't feel empty anymore. Each tree leaned fractionally closer. Each branch twitched as if adjusting its angle to observe me better. And every step I took seemed to echo louder than it should have, reverberating as though the ground was thinner here, like walking above the hollow of a drum. Halfway back to the trail, another knock sounded from the right, short, sharp, closer. It wasn't coming from a tree. I knew that with a certainty that hollowed out my stomach. Another knock followed, this time from the left. Then silence. I kept walking. At the edge of the tree line, where the filtered forest light met the path's open clarity, the tension in the air loosened in a way that almost made my knees buckle. I stepped back onto the trail, inhaling greedily as though I'd surfaced from underwater. My radio crackled on my chest. Just static, but the sound grounded me enough to keep me moving until the woods felt like just woods again. I didn't tell anyone what I'd experienced. New rangers don't start stories with a fry for Vallis Live. I think I saw something watching me near the caves or something, breathed in the dark. They'd assign you more desk work, more supervision, or worse, they'd write it off as fear and inexperience and start treating you like a liability rather than someone learning the forest's language. So I kept quiet. That was my mistake. Fear thrives in silence. Secrets grow teeth. It was weeks before I went near that part of the ridge again. My duties took me elsewhere, north to the river basin, west toward the fire boundary. Routine patrols, lost hikers, trail maintenance. I slept a little worse, woke a little sharper, found myself listening to sounds I'd never noticed before. A branch settling in the wind, a distant echo, the crackle of something moving through brush that I would always convince myself was a deer. Then winter came early that year. Storms rolled over the mountains, thick with ice and weighted skies, and one evening we received a report. A local man, mid-60s, familiar with the area, hadn't returned home. He'd gone hunting near Ridgewell Peak, too close to those caves for comfort. His wife tried to reach him on the radio he kept clipped to his vest, but she only heard a distorted hum, like he'd stepped into a place where the signal didn't know how to behave. We assembled a small search team at dawn. I was assigned the southern sweep, closest to the cave system. I didn't argue. You don't earn respect by avoiding the places that scare you. Snow muffled the world as we moved. Thick flakes clung to branches, weighing them into crooked shapes that looked like limbs frozen mid-reach. Our boots sank into fresh powder, leaving deep impressions that stretched behind us like a trail of soft shadows. The cold was biting, but beneath it, another sensation simmered, a dread I couldn't shake. The same quiet pressure I'd felt that day months before. A mile in, we found the first sign, a set of tracks, wide, heavy, upright. Not the missing man's, not any animal native to the region, but the strangest part was the snow filling the prints. Not the usual collapse, this was deliberate. The snow inside each print had been packed down with precision, as though something had pressed its palm over them to erase details. We followed them, because that was our job, even though every breath began to feel like a warning. The forest grew darker again, even in daylight. Snow-laden branches bent low enough to force us to duck beneath them. The air thickened, the cold sharpening, carrying a familiar scent, damp fur and earth steeped in time. One of the other rangers pointed toward the distance. There, half buried in the snow, was the missing man's glove. Inside it, still curled, was his hand. Not severed, not torn off, just placed there, delicately. As if returned, the forest went impossibly silent, no wind, no breath, no sound. Then, from somewhere deep in the trees, came the knock, slow, Measured 3 times, the same rhythm I'd heard months before, but this time something else followed. A low, rumbling voice. Not human, not animal. A word breathed in a language I didn't recognize. Every hair on my body lifted. The other rangers looked at me, expecting me to explain, to say whether this was normal, something I'd encountered before. All I could whisper was no. We turned to retreat, to regroup, to get away long enough to make a plan. But behind us, far too close, snow shifted under a massive weight. Branches snapped. A shadow moved between the trees, impossibly tall, blending with the dark. Then a second knock answered from the opposite direction. We were surrounded, and something in the forest was done waiting. The moment that second knock answered from the opposite direction, a cold clarity settled into my chest, a feeling I'd only experienced once before, years prior, when a wildfire turned on us faster than predicted. It's the abrupt, razor-edged awareness that you are no longer in control, that the forest has shifted from something you work in to something you survive in, and what surrounded us that day wasn't weather, terrain, or wildlife. It was intention. The ranger to my left, a man twice my size, experienced steady, lifted his hand instinctively toward the flare gun on his belt, but he never drew it. The branches above us responded before he could even unclip the holster. A deep, heavy thud sounded overhead. Snow shook loose from the pines, this cascading down in silent curtains. A shadow passed between the branches, massive, upright, fluid in a way no heavy creature should be. I glimpsed forms moving in the periphery, the suggestion of long arms, a sloping head, fur catching the faint light. But every time I turned, the forest reclaimed the shape, pulling it back into the dark like it wasn't meant to be seen clearly. The knocking resumed. Not as an echo now, but as a communication, one from the left, then the right, then behind us. Different rhythms, different distances, coordinated, calling, responding, surrounding. This wasn't random. This wasn't curiosity. This was strategy. I raised my hand, signaling the others to stay still. The forest held its breath with us. We listened, hoping for any sign that the missing man was alive. But only the knocks came, methodical, spaced perfectly apart, reverberating like the hollow thump of bone against wood. The newest ranger in our group, barely 23, still holding on to the belief that most legends were exaggerations, whispered, "Do you hear that?" I didn't answer. There was no sense in validating fear when silence was all that kept us from falling apart. Then something changed. A low groan rippled across the forest floor, so deep I felt it in my rib cage. It came from below us, not the surface, but beneath the snow-packed dirt, as though the ground itself was shifting in uneasy sleep. The tall ranger muttered something under his breath, something I'd never heard him say before. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of resignation usually reserved for those who finally understand they've stepped somewhere sacred and unwelcome. We needed to move. I gestured for a slow retreat, 3 steps back, stay low, no sudden sounds. Every ranger knows movement draws predators. And though I still clung to some fraying thread of rational explanation, every instinct I had told me that whatever hunted these woods was studying us the same way we studied tracks in the snow. We stepped backward. 1 step, 2. On the 3rd step, the forest reacted. A crack. Not like a branch snapping, but like a boulder splitting under pressure, echoed through the trees. Snow sprayed from the right as something enormous shifted its weight. The youngest ranger stumbled, slipping on an icy patch, and the sound of his fall tore through the silence like lightning. That was all it took. From the trees behind us came a guttural exhale, fast, sharp, hungry. Not human, not bear, something deeper. Something with a chest large enough to store a roar it chose not to release. I shouted for everyone to move. We ran, not toward the caves, not deeper into the forest, but toward the only safe direction left. Uphill, toward the ridge where the terrain thinned enough that nothing could circle us without being seen. Snow swallowed our steps. Branches clawed at our coats. Breath condensed into frantic clouds. Behind us, something massive followed. Its footfalls were not heavy in the way you'd expect from a large creature. They were controlled, purposeful, as though it knew how to distribute its weight to remain almost quiet. Almost, but not quiet enough. The thump, thump, thump of its gait echoed behind us, matched by the rhythmic knocks coming from the trees, knocks that now formed a pattern, like a signal urging it forward. We broke through a slope of younger pines, the ground rising sharply beneath our boots. The forest thinned just enough for light to reach us, a pale gray sheet across the snow. But the sense of being hunted didn't fade. If anything, the space made us feel more exposed. Just ahead, the ridge split into two narrow paths, one leading toward the overlook, the other dipping around the outer edge of the cliffs. I knew which one was safer. The outer path. The overlook would trap us. I motioned left, but the young ranger panicked. Instead of following the group, he sprinted toward the overlook, slipping between two boulders and disappearing from view. I shouted after him, but fear drowns logic. It always does. The tall ranger and I exchanged a look, unspoken, urgent, and we diverted after him, leaving the rest of the team to secure the safer route and radio for backup. Every step toward the overlook felt like stepping into a throat, narrow, echoing, too easy for something to corner you. We found him 30 meters down the path, standing perfectly still, staring into the valley below. His face was slick with sweat despite the cold, his breath coming in shallow bursts. At first, I thought he'd frozen in fear. Then he said something that made my blood chill more than the wind ever could. It whispered my name. His voice was hollow, thin, scraped raw. I stepped beside him slowly, searching his eyes for signs of hypoxia or shock. But he wasn't looking at me. He was looking past me, toward the tree line behind us. I turned. At first, I saw nothing but the swaying pines. Then between two trunks, a shape emerged, not stepping forward, but leaning as though its upper body extended unnaturally from the dark. Tall, broad, bent at the spine like a figure ducking under a doorway too small for its frame. Its fur was the color of wet stone, long, matted, frost clinging to the tips. But what struck me wasn't its appearance. It was its posture, casual, almost studying us with the quiet patience of something that had no reason to rush. Then it inhaled. The sound pulled the air toward it, like breath being vacuumed from the cold. The young ranger's chest seized in response. He took a step backward, right onto loose snow. It gave way. He slipped, only a few feet. Not enough to fall from the cliff, but enough to make a sound, and that sound changed everything. The creature straightened, slowly, vertebrae cracking like distant gunfire. It stepped from the shadows, one massive foot landing with a soft, deliberate thud. Not charging, not stalking, walking. Like it had all the time in the world, the tall ranger raised the flare gun, hands trembling. He didn't want to shoot. None of us did. Something about the creature felt ancient, like harming it would invoke consequences we couldn't comprehend. But we had no choice. The young ranger was slipping, sliding dangerously close to the cliff's edge, and the creature took another step toward him. I nodded at the tall ranger. He fired. The flare streaked into the trees, exploding into a blossom of red light. For a heartbeat, the creature froze, illuminated fully for the first time. Its eyes were not human, not animal. They were reflective like obsidian, catching the flare's glow and twisting it into something primal. Its face was long, sharp, angled like something carved by erosion instead of grown by nature. The mouth was wrong, horizontal, too still, until it slowly, very slowly, began to open. Not in a roar, in a smile. The flare dimmed. The light died. The creature moved. Fast. Too fast. It crossed half the distance before we even realized the snow beneath our feet was shifting again. The young ranger slid further toward the cliff. The tall ranger grabbed him, hauling him backward. I stepped between them and the creature, heart pounding, breath slicing in and out. Then the knocking returned. Not from the trees this time. From the ground beneath our boots, like a call, like an answer, like something rising. The ground vibrated beneath us, not violently, not enough to break the surface of the snow, but enough to feel like something large was shifting in the unseen earth beneath our boots. The knocking grew more distinct, almost rhythmic, as though the forest itself had a heartbeat rising from below. The creature froze mid-step, head tilting, eyes glinting with recognition. It wasn't reacting to us, not anymore. It was reacting to that sound. The tall ranger dragged the young one toward me, both of them gasping from cold and panic. The cliff's rim loomed only a few feet behind them, the valley far below, hidden by a sheet of pale fog. The creature pivoted slightly, body angled toward the vibrations underfoot, ribs expanding with a slow, deliberate breath. It felt less like observing us and more like waiting for something. A crack split the snow. A deep fissure, thin but growing, spidered across the path. I grabbed both rangers by their jackets and hauled them backward, slipping on the slick ground as the crack widened with a pressure that had no place in the physics of winter. Snow shivered, trembling like disturbed skin. The forest around us fell into an unnatural silence. No wind, no branches bending, no distant groan of shifting ice. Just that rhythmic knock-knock-knock rising from beneath the earth like something buried was knocking back. The creature inhaled again, so slow it felt like time stalled. Its chest rose with a tremor that shook flakes from its fur. In that stillness, I noticed something I hadn't before. Its breath fogged the air thicker than ours. Not white, not gray, but a darker vapor that curled like smoke rising from a cold flame. The ground thudded once more. A pulse, a warning. Or a summons. Without thinking, I shouted at the others to move. The tall ranger slung the young one over his arm and bolted toward the outer path, snow spraying behind them. I backed away, step by careful step, facing the creature. Every muscle braced. I expected it to lunge, to close the gap with those impossible strides. But it didn't move. Instead, it lowered its head, pressed one enormous hand to the snow, and knocked. A single heavy, deliberate knock. Instantly, the vibrations under the ground answered. The knocking synced, its rhythm matched, calling and responding like a language. My throat tightened, breath halting. This wasn't just a creature. This wasn't a lone, wandering relic of the forest. This was part of something organized, something old. Something that communicated not through voices, but through the bones of the earth itself. The creature turned its head toward me slowly, and this time, God help me, its mouth didn't stretch in the wrong kind of smile. It whispered. A sound so low it didn't reach my ears through air, but through my bones. It vibrated in my ribs, my teeth, the base of my skull. A language that didn't want to be understood, only obeyed. The ground trembled sharply. Snow broke open behind the creature. For a split second, I saw something immense shifting beneath the surface, shapes that should not fit beneath the shallow crust of winter. But I didn't have the breath or the sanity to process it. I ran. Not for the outer path. My team had already taken it, but toward the ridge's main trail, where the incline rose and the forest opened just enough for daylight to touch. The knocking pursued me, not from behind, but from under the earth, following my steps with unnatural precision. Every thud lined up with my footfalls, as though something tracked me through the ground, mirroring the pattern of my fear. When I reached the tree line where the slope leveled, the knocking stopped. The silence hit like a wall. I collapsed behind a fallen log, chest heaving, lungs burning from cold and adrenaline. Snow stung my face where it had been kicked up in my frantic escape. My ears rang with phantom echoes. The forest beyond the ridge remained unnervingly still. Not a branch shifted. Not a breath of wind whispered through the needles. For a moment, I thought I'd escaped. Then a shadow slid silently between the pines ahead. I jerked upright, pulse spiking. But it wasn't the creature. Not the tall one. Not the silhouette that watched me from the cave. This figure was smaller, human-sized, wearing something dark, heavy, familiar. A coat, one of ours. At first, relief washed through me. I thought it might be the ranger from the North Sweep, the one sent to meet us partway. But as the figure stepped closer, so something in its movement struck me wrong. Too smooth, too quiet. No crunch of snow beneath its boots, no sway of arms. It glided more than walked. I called out, voice cracking from the cold. "Hey, you okay? Where's the rest of your team?" No reply. It kept coming, slow, steady, unnaturally upright. When it was close enough for me to see the patch on its jacket, my breath caught. It wasn't one of ours. Not anymore. The patch was from an older uniform, one retired decades ago. one I'd only seen in photos in the ranger station's hallway. My brain tried to make sense of it, tried to find logic in something that defied every rule I knew. But reason doesn't stand a chance when the world shifts beneath it. The figure reached the edge of the clearing. Snow clung to its boots like it had walked through miles of forest. Its face, if there was one, was obscured in shadow under the brim of an old ranger hat, the kind issued before I was born. I stepped back. It stepped forward. I reached for my radio. It reached for nothing. I raised my voice. It lowered its head. Then it spoke. The voice didn't come from its throat. It came from behind me, from the trees, from the air, or from the ground. "Where are you going?" The voice was human, male, mid-40s, familiar enough to make my knees buckle. But the figure standing in front of me had no visible mouth, no exposed skin, no breath in the cold, and the voice echoed through the forest like a memory torn loose. When the figure lifted its head fully, the shadow over its face faded just enough for the light to catch the hollow where its eyes should have been. Empty sockets. Black, deep, filled with a glistening moisture like the inside of a cave. I scrambled backward so fast I slipped in the snow. My shoulder hit the ground. Pain flared. The figure didn't react. It simply turned its head toward the sound of the knocking now rising again beneath the surface, closer this time, almost under my own body. I pushed to my feet, heart slamming in my chest, and ran toward the sound of distant voices. My team, thank God, faint but real. Human. Alive. Alive. The shadowed ranger did not follow, but as I fled, the knocking beneath me matched pace again, like something underground followed my every step. I broke through the tree line where the others were gathered, their faces white with fear and frost. The tall ranger grabbed my shoulders, steadying me. "What happened?" he asked. But behind him, the snow shifted. The knocking rose one last time, 3 slow beats. Knock, knock, knock. Then the forest exhaled, a long, deep sigh, and every sound ceased. That was the day I stopped dismissing the local stories. The day I learned the forest didn't just hold dangers from above, it hid them below. And some things in those woods weren't roaming freely. They were guarding something buried, something that wanted out. For weeks after that day, the knocking followed me, even when it wasn't there. It lived in my memory the way thunder holds its echo after a storm. I'd lie awake in my cabin at night, staring at the wooden ceiling where the knots in the pine shifted shape in the dark, and I'd hear it again, that slow, deliberate rhythm. Knock. 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 Sometimes faint, sometimes close enough that I'd sit upright, convinced something was standing just outside the door. But whenever I checked, the world remained still, normal, deceptively normal. But fear doesn't release you just because the forest pretends nothing happened. The missing hunter was never found, not fully. Search crews uncovered more of his belongings, scattered with eerie precision, as though placed intentionally. His compass resting upright on a stump, his hat folded cleanly at the entrance of a narrow ravine, his favorite hunting knife embedded in the trunk of a cedar with the blade pointing downward. No blood, no footprints, no signs of struggle, just absence. An absence the forest refused to explain. The tall ranger and I filed our reports carefully, choosing our words with restraint, avoiding anything that could be dismissed as panic-induced delusion. But he and I both knew the truth. We had been hunted, observed, tested, and whatever intelligence lurked under the pines wasn't entirely above ground. Still, the work didn't stop. The forest doesn't pause for your fear. Trails erode, campfires smolder, visitors wander where they shouldn't. A ranger without resolve is a liability, so I kept walking my patrols, radio clipped to my chest, boots pressing new stories into the old earth. But every time I passed the southern stretch of Ridgewell Peak, where the cave mouth yawned like a secret kept too long, I felt that same oppressive silence settle on my skin. The air grew colder, my breath thickened, and sometimes in the distance I'd hear a sound that made my heart lock in my chest. A knock. Always 3, always measured, always waiting for something to answer. One afternoon near late winter, after heavy snowfall had buried the forest in deep, unbroken white, I received a call about an abandoned campsite along the old timberline spur. A family passing through had spotted it from the road. They reported no movement, no smoke, no figures, just a single tent half collapsed beneath the snow. Could have been hikers caught in the storm. Could have been nothing. Could have been the forest taking something it wasn't supposed to. I headed out alone. By then, the sky had taken on a bruised purple hue, the sun sinking behind a curtain of thick clouds. Cold seeped upward from the ground, numbing my legs through the insulated layers. The world felt suspended, as though time was tightening around the trees. When I reached the campsite, the first thing I noticed was how tidy everything seemed. The tent was crooked, yes, but not wind-tossed or torn. A pair of boots stood neatly side by side near the entrance, untouched by drift. The snow around the site was strangely smooth, unbroken. Not a single footprint, not even from deer or foxes. Like the forest had swallowed everything except the tent. I crouched and brushed snow from the flap, expecting to find sleeping bags, maybe abandoned gear. Instead, I found carvings. The entire inside of the tent had been scored with marks, hundreds of them, etched deep into the nylon. Some straight lines, some jagged, some curved in looping spirals. But the center held a single distinct pattern, 3 vertical lines, a space, 3 vertical lines, a space, 3 vertical lines. It took me a moment to recognize the rhythm. Knock, knock, knock. The hair on my arms rose despite the cold. I pulled back, scanning the trees. Something shifted at the edge of the clearing. Not the creature, not the tall one, not the one with obsidian eyes, but a shape I recognized from that terrifying day near the ridge. The figure wearing the old ranger uniform. The same heavy coat, the same outdated hat. It stood motionless among the pines, half obscured by falling snow. This time, I did not call out. This time, I knew better. It stepped forward slowly, leaving no indent in the fresh snow, and turned its head to the side as if listening. Then, without lifting an arm, without moving its mouth, it whispered again, using the forest's breath, not its own. Go back. The voice vibrated through the air like distant thunder, low and aching. For the first time, I felt something inside the figure beyond fear or threat. Sadness. A remnant of something that used to be human, trapped in a form the forest had repurposed. I stepped backward, one hand reaching for my radio, but as soon as my boot pressed into the snow, the knocking began beneath it. So faint I barely recognized it at first. A pulse, a warning, a demand. From the ground behind me came an answering knock. Then another, then another. The figure in the old uniform stiffened. Its hollow eyes turned toward the earth beneath my feet as though it could see straight into the dirt. Then it raised its head and whispered, softer this time, like a plea. Don't let them hear you. The ground under me thudded again, faster now. I stumbled backward from the tent. The air thickened, a dull roar hummed in my bones. The knocking grew louder, rising from below like a pack of fists pounding on the underside of the world. I ran. Branches whipped at my face. Snow clawed at my boots. The knocking followed, beneath, around, inside me, tugging at the edges of my sanity. Between the trees I glimpsed movement. Not one shape this time, but several. Tall, too tall, their silhouettes marching between the pines with silent strides, watching me flee like prey that had finally broken into a sprint. I didn't look back again. When I reached the trailhead, the knocking stopped. My legs buckled. I collapsed into the snow, gasping. Then I heard it, a faint rustle behind me, soft like fabric brushing against bark. I whipped around, expecting the creature, expecting the shadow, expecting anything but what I saw. The figure in the old ranger uniform stood at the edge of the clearing. Snowflakes drifted through the empty hollows where its eyes used to be. It raised one hand, not in threat, but in farewell. Then it pointed to the forest, to the caves, to the ridge where the first silhouette had watched me. And in a voice that carried the memory of a man long gone, it whispered, "They're waking." Then it vanished, dissolving like smoke into the winter air. I don't tell these stories because I want to frighten people. I don't tell them because I enjoy entertaining old legends. I tell them because every year, more hikers go missing near the ridge. More campsites are found empty. More people hear knocks in the dead of night. And I know, now more than ever, that something buried beneath those mountains is stirring. Something old, something intelligent, something the pines have tried to warn us about for generations. Some nights when the wind rattles my cabin windows and the forest leans close enough to touch, I hear it again. That same pattern, faint but persistent. Knock, knock, knock. Not asking to be let out, asking to be remembered. And as long as I walk these woods, as long as the pines keep their ancient watch, I will remember. Not because I'm brave, not because I am strong, but because something in those woods once spared me. Something in the dark decided I should live long enough to tell you. The spirits of the pines still whisper, and the dead beneath them are starting to knock.